The cardboard box was almost empty. A coffee mug with a chipped handle. A small potted succulent his daughter had named Pickle. A single manila folder held shut with a rubber band that had gone soft with age. Elijah Grant carried it through the lobby of Ashcroft Dynamics with both hands, like it weighed more than it looked. Nobody in that lobby knew his name. Not really. They knew the name on his badge. They knew the quiet man from the 14th floor who ate lunch alone and left at exactly 5:30 because his daughter got out of aftercare at 6. They knew he never argued, never bragged, never asked for anything. What they did not know was that the man walking past the marble reception desk with a box of almost nothing had once signed his name on the deed to that very building. Security guard Miles Denton looked up from his phone as Elijah passed. He'd seen 100 people walked out over the years. Something about this one didn't sit right, though he couldn't have said why. Behind Elijah, near the elevator bank, a woman in a charcoal blazer stepped out of a car that had just pulled up outside, a car with a small gold emblem on the hood that most of the building's employees had never once seen parked at street level. She was already moving fast. "Where is he?" she asked the first person she passed. "The man who just left. Where did he go?" Nobody answered right away, because nobody understood the question yet. They would. Within the hour, that lobby would be the loudest, stillest room in the entire company's history, a room full of people trying to reconcile what they thought they knew about a man they had walked past for 2 years without ever really seeing him. But before any of that could happen, someone had to ask the question that would end up echoing through every floor of Ashcroft Dynamics by the end of the day. Who fired him? Stay with this one. It's about to get very quiet in that lobby. 2 years earlier, Elijah Grant had walked into Ashcroft Dynamics for the first time as an entry-level data analyst. Dressed in a gray button-down that had been ironed at 6 in the morning on the same board, he used to iron his daughter's school uniform. He carried a badge with his own real name on it, because he had never once been famous enough for anyone to recognize the name. Not the way people recognize faces from magazine covers. Elijah had spent his whole career on the other side of the cameras, building things quietly while his business partner did the talking. That morning, he had knelt down in the hallway of their small apartment to fix his daughter's shoelaces before school. "Daddy, you're going to be late," 7-year-old Amara told him, arms crossed, imitating a tone she'd clearly borrowed from someone. "I've got time," Elijah said, tying a careful double knot. "Can't have you tripping on your first day of 2nd grade. You said that yesterday, too." That's because it's still true today. Amara considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could manage, then nodded like she was signing off on the explanation. She slung her backpack over one shoulder, a backpack with a small tear at the seam that Elijah had promised to fix for 3 weeks running, and reached for his hand. They walked 2 blocks to her school together every morning. It was the same walk they had taken since she was 4. Elijah never rushed it, no matter how tight his schedule got, because somewhere in the last 3 years, that walk had become the steadiest part of his day. His wife, Naomi, used to make that walk with them. She'd been gone for 3 years now, a sickness that arrived quietly and left just as quietly, taking almost everything with it. Elijah didn't talk about her much, not because he didn't think about her. He thought about her constantly, but because grief, in his experience, didn't need an audience. It needed structure, mornings, shoelaces, packed lunches, a reason to keep both feet moving. After Naomi died, Elijah made a decision that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. He walked away from the company he'd spent a decade building from a garage workshop into one of the largest engineering firms on the East Coast. He handed the public-facing reins to his college roommate and closest friend, Daniel Voss, and disappeared from boardrooms, headlines, and shareholder calls entirely. Nobody in the press had ever gotten a clean photo of Elijah Grant to begin with. He'd always been the one behind the whiteboard, not the one behind the podium. Daniel did the talking. Elijah did the building. It worked for years, and after Naomi passed, it gave him something most billionaires never get to have: total invisibility. He used it. He sold a house, moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from Amara's school, Grew a short beard he never used to have. Started wearing reading glasses he didn't strictly need, just because they changed the shape of his face in photographs nobody was taking anymore. And 6 months after burying his wife, he applied for an entry-level data analyst position at Ashcroft Dynamics under his real name, because the truth was the best disguise he had. Nobody expects the invisible founder of a company to be sitting 3 floors below payroll, running spreadsheets for $18 an hour less than what he used to spend on lunch meetings. He didn't need the money. He needed the mornings. He needed something ordinary to hold on to while he figured out how to be a father without a partner standing beside him. Nobody on the 14th floor knew any of that. What they knew was that Elijah Grant showed up early, left on time, never took credit for anything, and had a peculiar habit of solving other people's spreadsheet problems without ever mentioning it afterward. They also knew he had a daughter, because sometimes her drawings appeared taped inside his cubicle, a stick-figure family of 2 holding hands under a sun with too many rays. What none of them knew was that inside the manila folder he carried to work every day sat sketches for systems that had, years earlier, quietly reshaped 3 different industries. Elijah kept the folder out of habit more than necessity. Old ideas, half-finished thoughts, a place where his mind still wandered when spreadsheets got dull. He never showed it to anyone, which meant nobody ever asked the one question that might have changed everything sooner. Who exactly is this quiet man in the gray button-down? They would find out, just not in the way any of them expected. The trouble on the 14th floor didn't start all at once. It built the way most quiet cruelty builds, one small decision at a time, each one easy to explain away on its own. It started with Preston Cole. Preston had been promoted to floor manager 8 months earlier, and he wore the title the way some men wear a suit 2 sizes too big, like he was still growing into the shoulders of it and compensating by standing taller than he needed to. He believed, deeply and without much self-examination, that authority had to be performed loudly to be respected at all. Elijah's quiet nature bothered him from the very first week. "You're not much of a talker, are you, Grant?" Preston said once, leaning against the edge of Elijah's cubicle with the particular posture of a man checking whether someone would flinch. "Not much, no." Elijah said, not looking up from his screen, "Some people think quiet means lazy. Some people think a lot of things." Preston laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind men used to cover the moment when they realized they didn't land the shot they were aiming for. He didn't forget it. Over the following months, a pattern quietly took shape. The kind of pattern that never shows up clearly enough on any single day to file a complaint about, but that adds up week after week into something unmistakable. When Elijah finished a project 2 days ahead of schedule, Preston presented the results to senior leadership without mentioning whose work it was. When a deadline moved up without warning, the extra hour somehow always landed on Elijah's desk, dropped there at 4:45 in the afternoon with just enough ambiguity attached that failure would look like his fault no matter what happened. When Elijah caught an error in a compliance report that could have cost the company a 6-figure penalty, Preston thanked him privately, then took the correction to leadership as his own initiative 20 minutes later. Elijah noticed every single instance. He said nothing, partly because he'd learned, over a decade of building companies, that some battles cost more than they're worth to win in the moment, and partly because he was watching, quietly, the same way he used to watch a system before deciding how to fix it, gathering data before making a single move. There was a woman on the floor, Renata Boyd, who'd worked compliance for 6 years and had a habit of double-checking everyone's numbers before submission out of nothing but conscientiousness. One Tuesday afternoon, Preston caught a rounding error in her report, a mistake so small it wouldn't have shifted a single decision downstream, and called out in the middle of the open floor, voice pitched loud enough to make sure everyone within 30 feet heard it. Renata sat very still while he spoke. Her face didn't move. Her hands stayed folded on the desk. "Understood," she said. "I'll fix it." After Preston walked away, she stared at her monitor for almost a full minute without touching the keyboard. Elijah watched that too. He filed away the same careful way he filed everything else, in the quiet mental ledger he'd been keeping since his first week on the floor. He thought about his late wife sometimes when he watched moments like that. Naomi had worked in a hospital billing department for years before they'd had enough saved up for her to stay home with Amara, and she used to come home describing exactly this kind of workplace, whether small, deniable cruelties that never rose to the level of formal complaint, but that wore people down floor by floor, year by year. It's not the big things that break people, she used to say. It's the thousand small ones nobody's willing to name. Elijah hadn't fully understood what she meant until he'd spent 8 months on the 14th floor of his own company, watching it happen in real time to people who had no idea who he really was. He kept showing up, kept doing his job well, kept picking Amara up at 6. But something in him was quietly counting. The morning everything changed started like any other, which is exactly the kind of morning storytellers know to be suspicious of. Amara wasn't feeling well. She complained of a stomachache the night before, the kind of complaint Elijah had learned over the years to take seriously without overreacting to. By 7 a.m., she still hadn't touched her cereal, and by the time he dropped her at school, her forehead felt warmer than it should have. "Call me if anything changes," he told the front office. The way he always did. The way any parent does who has learned that some promises can't be broken twice. At 10:40 that morning, the school called. Elijah didn't hesitate. He closed his laptop mid-sentence, told the nearest co-worker he had a family emergency, and walked out of the building without stopping at Preston's desk to ask permission. Because in 6 years of parenting alone, he'd learned that permission wasn't always available in the moment a child needed you, and some decisions simply didn't leave room for a conversation first. Preston saw him leaving from across the floor. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. In Preston's mind, the story wrote itself the moment he saw Elijah heading for the elevator in the middle of a workday without stopping to explain. By the time Elijah returned the next morning, Amara fine, fever broken, tucked safely back into her normal routine. The story Preston had built in his head had already hardened into something he was ready to say out loud, in front of everyone. The staff meeting started at 9. Elijah walked in 3 minutes early, the way he always did, and took his usual seat near the back. Preston didn't wait for the meeting to reach its scheduled agenda. "Before we start," he said, loud enough to cut through the room's low murmur, "I want to address something. Commitment." He let the word sit there for a second. This team works because everyone pulls their weight, every single person. And when someone decides they can just walk out in the middle of the day without a word to anyone, that's not commitment. That's a burden on the rest of us. He didn't say Elijah's name. He didn't have to. Every head in the room had already turned. Elijah felt the weight of it land, the particular kind of public exposure that doesn't announce itself with volume so much as with silence. The silence of a room deciding, collectively and without discussion, not to defend you. "I had a family emergency," Elijah said quietly. "My daughter was sick. The school called." "There's a process for that," Preston said. "You didn't follow it. You just left. I told someone on the floor before You told a co-worker." "Not me. Not HR. You just left Grant, and I had to hear about it secondhand like everyone else." Elijah looked around the room. A few people lowered their eyes. Renata Boyd's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Nobody said anything. That was the part that stayed with Elijah longest, later, when he thought back on it. Not Preston's voice, which he'd heard raised before, but the particular quality of that silence. The silence of good people who knew something wasn't right and had decided, each for their own private reasons, that it wasn't their place to say so out loud. He'd seen that silence before, in boardrooms, in hospital hallways, in a dozen rooms over the years where people quietly calculated the cost of speaking up and decided it was too high. Preston reached into a folder on the table and slid a single sheet of paper toward him. "Effective today," he said. "I've spoken with HR. This isn't the first pattern we've noted with your reliability. We're letting you go." The room went very still. Elijah looked down at the paper, then back up at Preston. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Something in him, The same something that had once sat across a table from investors trying to lowball a company he'd built from nothing. The same something that had sat beside his wife's hospital bed without flinching. Simply settled into a kind of clarity that had no room left in it for panic. "Understood," he said. He stood, gathered the folder from his desk, the mug, the small plan his daughter had given him for Father's Day with a hand-drawn tag that said "World's Best Dad" in crooked crayon letters, and placed them into a cardboard box that someone from HR had already, almost cruelly, left sitting beside his chair in anticipation. He didn't look at Preston again. He walked toward the elevator with the box in both hands, past desks where conversations dropped to a whisper as he passed, past Renata Boyd, who caught his eye for just a second and looked away first, carrying something in her expression that looked almost like an apology she didn't have the courage to say out loud. The elevator doors closed. Nobody in that building had any idea what was about to happen next. Outside, the morning air was cool enough to fog slightly at the edges. Elijah set the box down on a low concrete railing near the entrance and stood there for a moment, not quite ready to walk to the train station yet. He thought about Amara, about how he'd explain this to her tonight. Not the firing itself, which he didn't need to understand in detail, but the fact that her father would be home a little more in the coming weeks, which she would probably be thrilled about in a way that made the whole situation feel simultaneously worse and strangely bearable. He took out his phone. There was one contact he almost never called, saved simply under the initial D, and for a long moment he stood there deciding whether this particular morning was worth breaking a habit of years. He pressed call. The line picked up on the second ring. "Eli," said the voice on the other end, warm and immediately alert in the specific way old friends recognize trouble before a single detail is shared. "It's been a while." "Daniel," Elijah said, "I need 5 minutes." "You've got as many as you need. What's going on?" Elijah told him, not with anger, not with drama, just the facts, laid out the same careful, structured way you usually lay out a technical problem in front of a room full of engineers. This happened, then this happened, then this. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Lie," Daniel said finally, his voice tighter now. "Do you understand what you just told me? Ashcroft is—" He stopped himself. "I need to make a call. Stay exactly where you are. Please." "Daniel, it's fine. It's just a job. I don't need—" "It's not about what you need," Daniel said. "It's about what just happened, and whether the people responsible for it understand what they actually did. Stay there. I mean it. Give me 20 minutes. The line went dead. Elijah stood on the sidewalk holding the phone, more confused than he'd expected to be by his own best friend's reaction. He'd expected sympathy, maybe an offer of a reference for whatever came next. He hadn't expected urgency. He didn't yet know that 18 months earlier, quietly and without any public announcement, Daniel had restructured Ashcroft Dynamics ownership in a way that gave Elijah's original holding company, still under Elijah's control, still carrying his signature on every founding document, a majority position in the very subsidiary where he had just spent 2 years filing spreadsheets under his own real name. Daniel had done it out of loyalty, assuming Elijah would never actually set foot inside one of the subsidiary offices, let alone take an entry-level job in one. He had been wrong about that, spectacularly, quietly wrong for 2 entire years. Inside the building, less than an hour later, a very different phone call was already reshaping the morning. Olivia Bennett, the regional CEO overseeing Ashcroft's operations division, had arrived for a previously scheduled inspection completely unrelated to any of it. She'd stepped out of her car expecting nothing more dramatic than a walkthrough of quarterly numbers. Instead, she stepped into a lobby that felt, the moment the door slid open, unmistakably wrong. Employees clustered near the windows in tight, whispering groups. Security guard Miles Denton stood frozen near the front desk, phone still in hand, staring at something on the screen like he wasn't sure whether to believe it. "What's going on?" Olivia asked the nearest person she recognized. "Someone just got fired," a junior analyst told her, voice low, from the 14th floor. "Quiet guy, data analyst." "That happens," Olivia said. Why does everyone look like the building's on fire? Because, the analyst said, there's a car parked outside that we've genuinely never seen down here before, and whoever's in it is asking for him by name. Olivia looked past her, through the glass doors, toward the street. A black sedan with a small gold emblem she recognized instantly. The emblem of Voss Holdings, Ashcroft's controlling parent entity, sat idling at the curb. A man in a dark coat was already halfway out of the back seat, moving with an urgency that didn't match the calm, unhurried culture Ashcroft executive floor usually projected. Olivia's stomach dropped, though she couldn't yet have explained why. She pushed through the doors and stepped outside. And that was the exact moment she saw Daniel Voss, a man whose face she had seen on the cover of 3 different business magazines, a man she had personally sat across from during shareholder calls, a man whose signature appeared on nearly every major decision Ashcroft's board had made in the last decade, standing on the sidewalk in front of quiet, unremarkable data analysts holding a cardboard box, and speaking to him like the ground beneath both their feet had just shifted. Lie, Daniel was saying, his voice carrying just far enough for Olivia to catch the edge of it. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Olivia stopped walking. The question landed in her chest like something physical. Who fired him? She turned back toward the building, toward the lobby full of employees who had spent the last 2 years walking past a man they'd never bothered to truly see, and she asked the question out loud, to no one and everyone at once, her voice carrying farther than she intended. Who fired him? The words moved through the building faster than any official announcement could have traveled. By the time Olivia stepped back inside, flanked now by Daniel Voss and a third man in a gray suit she didn't immediately recognize, the entire 14th floor had already assembled near the elevator bank, drawn by the particular electricity that spreads through an office the instant everyone senses something enormous has just happened and nobody yet understands what. Preston Cole stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed, still operating under the assumption that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with him. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took Daniel Voss to step off the elevator, scan the floor, and ask a single question in a voice that had gone very quiet and very precise. Where's the manager who terminated Elijah Grant this morning? Nobody moved for a second. Then, slowly, several people turned toward Preston. He felt the shift before he fully understood it. The particular sensation of an entire room's attention rotating toward you like a searchlight finding its target. That would be me, Preston said. Is there a problem? Daniel studied him for a long moment before answering, the kind of look a man gives when he's deciding exactly how much restraint the situation requires. You terminated the majority shareholder of this company's parent holding entity, Daniel said, over a sick child in a misform. The words didn't land immediately. Preston actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, the kind people make when their brain hasn't caught up to information that doesn't fit anywhere in their existing model of the world. I'm sorry, the analyst. Grant, that's not possible. He's been on the floor for 2 years. He fills out expense reports. He eats lunch by himself. He also built the underlying architecture this entire company was founded on, Daniel said, before either of us were old enough to know what a holding structure even was. He was writing code in a garage that eventually became 3 separate divisions of this business. I've known him for over 20 years. He is the reason any of us have jobs to lose in the first place. The room had gone completely silent now. The specific silence Olivia would later describe to a friend as the sound of several hundred assumptions collapsing at once. Renata Boyd, standing near the front of the group, felt something tighten in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She thought about the quiet man who had once, without ever mentioning it afterward, quietly fixed a formula error in one of her spreadsheets before it reached leadership, sparing her a public correction she never even knew she'd nearly received. She thought about the drawings taped inside his cubicle, the stick-figure family under a sun with too many rays. Preston's face had gone the color of the wall behind him. I didn't. There was no way for me to know that, he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he seemed to hear how thin they sounded. Nobody told me. He never said anything. "That's the part you're not understanding," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "He never says anything. That's who he is. He spent the last 2 years sitting 3 floors below where he could have parked himself as chairman, because he wanted his daughter to grow up around an ordinary life instead of a name and a headline. And in the middle of that, when his kid got sick, and he did exactly what any decent parent would do, you stood in front of this entire floor and called him unreliable." Preston opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Olivia stepped forward before the silence could stretch any further. "I want the personnel file," she said. "All of it. Every incident this floor has logged against him in the last 6 months. Today." A junior HR coordinator near the back of the crowd nodded quickly and disappeared toward the stairwell, grateful for a reason to move. Outside, none of them yet knew, Elijah was still standing on the sidewalk with his cardboard box, unaware that the ground floor of the building he'd once designed the original blueprints for was currently rearranging itself entirely around the fact of his own quiet existence. He was about to walk back through those doors for the first time not as an anonymous employee, but as a man everyone in that lobby was suddenly, desperately trying to understand. Elijah stepped back to the glass doors 10 minutes later, box still in hand, because Daniel had called again and simply said, "Come back inside, Eli. Please. There are some things that need to happen, and they need to happen with you standing here." The lobby went quiet the moment he entered. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. Phones that had been half-raised to record the strange morning lowered slightly, as if people weren't sure anymore whether documenting this moment was appropriate or intrusive. Elijah didn't perform for the room. He wasn't the kind of man who knew how to, even if he'd wanted to. He simply walked toward the small cluster of executives near the elevator bank. Daniel, Olivia, the man in the gray suit who turned out to be Ashcroft's general counsel, and set the cardboard box down on the reception desk with the same unhurried care he used for everything. "You didn't have to make this a scene," he told Daniel quietly. "I would have handled it on my own." "I know you would have," Daniel said. "That's exactly the problem. You always handle everything on your own, Eli. Some things need witnesses." Olivia stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Grant," she said. "Olivia Bennett. I run operations for this division, and I owe you an apology that I don't think fits in a handshake, but I'm going to start there anyway." Elijah shook her hand. "You didn't do anything. I let culture exist on this floor that made this possible," she said. "That's not nothing." Behind her, Preston stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, arms no longer crossed. Posture collapsed into something smaller than the version of himself that had walked into the staff meeting that morning with such certainty. Elijah looked at him for a long moment. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the confrontation everyone assumed was coming. The dramatic reversal, the public dressing down, the moment where the quiet man finally got to be the loud one. It didn't come. "Mr. Cole," Elijah said instead, his voice even, without theater in it. "Can I ask you something?" Preston nodded, unable to manage words. "Did you actually believe I was unreliable? Or did you just believe I wouldn't push back if you said so?" The question landed harder than any accusation could have. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. I don't know," he finally admitted, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the words. "I think I assumed quiet meant weak. I think I built a whole story about you in my head because you never gave me a reason to think otherwise. And it was easier to believe that story than to actually ask you a question." "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me all morning," Elijah said. He turned to Daniel. "I don't want him fired." The words dropped into the room like something nobody had expected to hear. Daniel frowned. "I'm not gonna lie after what he did. I know what he did," Elijah said. "I watched it happen to other people on that floor for months before it happened to me. Renata." He glanced toward her, and she startled slightly at being named. The rounding error, the public correction. "I watched that too, and I didn't say anything, because I told myself it wasn't my place yet. That's on me as much as it's on him." He looked back at Preston. "Firing you doesn't fix a floor that let this happen for months before I ever walked in. It just removes one name from a pattern that's bigger than you. I'd rather fix the pattern." Preston stared at him, visibly struggling to hold himself together. "Why would you do that?" he asked quietly. "After what I put you through?" Elijah considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Because my daughter is going to ask me tonight why I'm home early," he said, "and I want to be able to tell her I chose to fix something instead of just walking away from it angry. That matters more to me than what happens to you specifically." Nobody in that lobby moved for a long moment. Then Olivia spoke, her voice steady but carrying real weight. "Mr. Grant, I understand you don't want anyone fired out of anger, but I need to be clear about something for the sake of everyone still working on that floor. Whatever happens next isn't just about you and Mr. Cole. It's about Renata, and it's about how many other people on that floor have spent months absorbing exactly this kind of treatment without anyone ever finding out." Elijah nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "So let's find out. All of it, not just what happened to me." And that was the moment the story stopped being about one man's quiet humiliation and started becoming something much bigger than anyone standing in that lobby had expected it to be. Over the following week, Ashcroft's 14th floor underwent a kind of quiet excavation that none of its employees had ever experienced before. An independent review team, brought in at Olivia's insistence, with full authority to examine performance records, project attribution logs, and internal communications going back 2 years, began the slow work of separating what had actually happened on that floor from what had simply been allowed to happen because nobody with power had been paying close enough attention. What they found didn't shock Elijah. He'd been quietly cataloging most of it for months. It shocked almost everyone else. Renata Boyd's file showed a documented pattern of public corrections for minor errors that, statistically, occurred far more often when Preston delivered them in front of full floor than when he delivered them privately. Errors made by other employees during that same period had, without exception, been handled quietly one-on-one. 3 separate projects that Elijah had completed ahead of schedule had been presented to senior leadership under Preston's name, with no acknowledgement of whose underlying work made the results possible. A junior analyst named Theo Marsh, who had left the company 8 months earlier under what his exit paperwork vaguely described as mutual agreement, turned out to file an informal complaint about workload distribution 3 weeks before his departure, a complaint that had been received by Preston directly and never escalated further. None of it, examined individually, looked dramatic enough to justify what it eventually added up to. That Elijah understood better than most people in that building was exactly how this kind of harm survived as long as it did. It never announced itself. It simply accumulated, one small deniable decision at a time, until the weight of it became undeniable only in hindsight. Preston wasn't fired. Elijah had insisted, and Olivia had honored it, though not without conditions. Preston was moved out of any management role entirely, placed into an individual contributor position with no direct authority over another employee's career, and required to complete a lengthy program focused less on corporate liability training and more on the kind of uncomfortable, personal reflection most people spend their whole careers avoiding. He kept his job. He lost the thing that had let him hurt people quietly for 8 months. Renata Boyd, along with 2 other employees whose files showed similar patterns of overlooked contribution and public correction, received formal review of their evaluation history, a review that ultimately reversed a promotion denial Renata had quietly absorbed a year before without ever fully understanding why it happened. She found Elijah in the break room the day the news came through, standing near the coffee machine with the same unhurried stillness he always carried. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said. "You don't need to thank me," Elijah said. "You did the work. I just made sure someone finally looked at it honestly." Renata hesitated. "Can I ask you something? Something that's been bothering me since all this happened." "Go ahead. Why did you stay so quiet for 2 years? You could have walked in on day 1, and none of this would have ever happened to anyone." Elijah thought about the question longer than she expected him to. "Because I needed to know what this place actually felt like for the people who don't get to walk out and call the chairman," he said finally. "If I'd shown up on day 1 wearing who I used to be, Everyone will perform a version of this floor that isn't real. I wanted to see the real one. I just didn't expect to end up part of the data myself. Renata didn't have a response to that. She simply nodded, and something in her posture, the same careful stillness Elijah had watched her hold during Preston's public correction months earlier, finally, visibly, let go. 3 months later, on a bright Tuesday afternoon that carried none of the tension of the morning that had started it all, Ashcroft Dynamics held its first all-staff gathering of the new fiscal quarter. Elijah stood near the back of the atrium, not on the stage, not near a microphone, because he had made it clear from the beginning that this was a story he wanted told with him standing at the center of a spotlight. Amara stood beside him. 7 years old and thoroughly unimpressed by the size of the crowd, more interested in the small paper airplane she'd folded out a stray meeting agenda someone had left on a nearby table. "Is this your work building?" she'd asked him that morning, tugging her shoes on while he waited by the door. "Part of it, yeah." "Do people know you're the boss now?" Elijah had considered how to answer that honestly. "I'm not really the boss, baby. I just help make sure the people who work here get treated fairly." Amara had nodded, satisfied with an explanation that made perfect sense to a 7-year-old and required no further follow-up. On the stage now, Daniel Voss stood beside Olivia Bennett, addressing a floor full of employees who, 3 months earlier, had watched the quiet man carry a cardboard box out to the front entrance without a single person stopping to ask if he was all right. "A few months ago," Daniel said, "this company failed someone who had given more to it quietly than almost anyone in this room will ever know. We're not here today to relive that. We're here because of what came after it. Because instead of asking for an apology and walking away, that person asked us to look honestly at what our culture let happen floor by floor for longer than any of us want to admit." He gestured, not toward Elijah directly, but toward the new reporting structure now displayed on the screen behind him, a direct, unfiltered channel that bypassed middle management entirely, connecting any employee at any level straight to an independent review team with the authority to act. "Starting today, that channel is permanent," Daniel said, "not because one incident embarrassed us into building it, because we finally understood that the people at the bottom of an org chart are usually the first ones to see when something's wrong, and for too long, this company gave them no safe way to say so." Renata Boyd, standing near the front with the rest of her floor, glanced back toward Elijah for just a second. He gave her the smallest nod, not a public gesture, not something the room would notice, just a private acknowledgement between two people who understood exactly what that channel would have meant to her 8 months earlier. After the gathering ended and the atrium slowly emptied, Amara tugged on her father's sleeve. "Can we get ice cream now? You said if I was good during the boring meeting, we'd get ice cream." "I did say that," Elijah admitted, smiling for what felt like the first time all week without effort behind it. As they walked toward the exit, Renata caught up to them near the doors. "Mr. Grant," she said, "for what it's worth, I don't think most people would have done what you did, come back after all that, and choose to fix it instead of just leaving." Elijah looked down at Amara, who had already lost interest in the adult conversation and was busy examining the folded wings of her paper airplane for structural improvements. "My wife used to say something," he told Renata. "She said it's not the big cruelties that break people. It's 1,000 small ones nobody's willing to name. I figured if that's true, the fix probably has to work the same way. One name at a time. One floor at a time." Renata didn't have anything to add to that. She simply nodded, the way people do when something lands exactly where it needs to. That evening, after ice cream, after bath time, after particular chaos of finding one missing sock that had somehow ended up on a couch, Elijah sat on the edge of Amara's bed while she settled under her blanket. Pickle the succulent now sitting on her windowsill instead of his old cubicle. "Daddy," she said, already half asleep, "are you going to work at that building again tomorrow?" "For a little while longer, yeah, just to help some people finish something important." "Then what?" Elijah thought about it. He thought about the folder full of old sketches he still hadn't shown anyone, The ideas had been quietly waiting for him to feel ready again. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent behind a cubicle wall, learning things about patience and dignity and quiet strength that no boardroom had ever taught him. "Then I think we'll figure out what comes next together," he said. "Same as always." Amara considered this with her usual seriousness, eyes already closing. "Good," she murmured, "as long as you still walk me to school." "Every single day," Elijah said. "That part never changes." She was asleep within a minute, one small hand still resting on top of the blanket, fingers loosely curled the way they'd been curled since she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. Elijah sat there a while longer than he needed to, the way he often did, in the quiet after day that had asked more of him than most. He thought about the cardboard box, still sitting in the corner of his closet, empty now. The mug and the folder and the little plant all returned to their proper places in a life that had, against every quiet odd, found its footing again. He thought about Preston and Renata and a floor full of people who would come to work tomorrow into something slightly more honest than what they'd had before. Mostly, he thought about how strange it was that the emptiest morning of the last 3 years, a cardboard box, a quiet walk out through a lobby full of strangers, had somehow become the beginning of something worth staying for. Goodness, he had learned a long time ago, is never loud about itself. It doesn't announce its presence, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't require an audience to be real. It just keeps showing up, morning after morning, shoelace after shoelace. And sometimes, when nobody is looking, it quietly changes the shape of everything around it. He reached over and turned off the small lamp beside her bed. In the dark, Amara shifted slightly, murmured something too soft to understand, and settled back into sleep, safe, unaware of everything the day had held, certain of nothing except the one fact that had never once wavered in her short life. Her father would be there in the morning. That was enough. It had always been enough.